documentary Looking for Langston came out, which was an experimental exploration of the world of Langston Hughes and of the Harlem Renaissance, in which the film immediately kind of precipitated him into being a kind of very sought-after filmmaker. He then went on in 1991 to make the film Young Soul Rebels, which won the Semaine de la Critique prize for the best film at the Cannes Film Festival. Now, while he's continued to gain commissions for kind of films, he's also kind of straddled that kind of film for art, for the art world. I think he's kind of one of the sort of rare people who kind of feels comfortable in both worlds, and has had work commissioned and shown at the ICA in London, at MoMA in Oxford, at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Helsinki, at the Irish Museum of Modern Art, and at the Centre d'Art Contemporain in Geneva, and the Johannesburg Biennale. He's already been invited to participate and collaborate in the next documenta, and will take up a residency as a fellow at the Art Pace San Antonio in October this year. The piece which he showed at Victoria Miro at the Paula Cooper Gallery in New York and will be shown there in New York later this season. At the same time, Julien retains, Isaac retains a kind of intellectual interest, which is manifested by his gift professorship at Harvard. Thank you very much, Mark. And it's a great pleasure and honor to be here, because that conference was truly fantastic, and was one of the highlights, I would say, of last year in terms of conferences. And I was very moved, obviously, by kind of what you was doing here at the AA in that conference. And so it's a great honor to come back and to present some of my work to you. What I'm going to do this evening is really, in a sort of loose way, try to talk a little bit about my work, which is, I guess, between cinema and the gallery space. And actually, I was approached by Sight and Sound magazine when I had my show at the Victoria Miro Gallery recently. And one of the awful things that happened was because obviously they felt somewhat that they could not find someone to interview me. You know, they said, "Oh, you're far too sort of intellectualized. You know, so why don't you interview yourself?" And so what I did was to conduct an interview with myself and to pose a number of questions to myself about this sort of juncture between cinema and the gallery space. And so what I'd like to do is to start with that as a way of, as it were, kind of introducing you to some of my sort of new work, which I've been making over the last couple of years. The pieces you're going to see is a piece called Trussed, which I made in 1996, which was commissioned by the Museum of Modern Art in Oxford. And then I'm going to show you a clip from Free, which is a piece that I did at the Victoria Miro Gallery. And then I'm going to show you my newest piece, Long Road to Mazatlan, which is a piece which I made in San Antonio. And all these pieces you'll sort of get to understand have some relationship to some questions which are to do with the notion of space and the notion of a sort of expanded cinema. But just to begin with this sort of interview with myself, I posed a question around the notion of digital technology and how that made me feel differently. How did that make me feel differently about the cinema? And so I replied by saying, the digital revolution at the beginning of the 90s transformed the way one works in the cinema. There's improved editing on Avid systems and huge advances in ways to manipulate the image. When I film now, I can flip the image, stretch it, desaturize it, slow it down, have 10 different cuts of a sequence in one day and perfect the image in a way that wasn't previously possible. While I was working on my last feature documentary with Mark Nash, France Fanon, Batsman's White Mask, he had made a prototype CD-ROM in 2 months at the New York City University. And one of the reasons actually we were approached to make this prototype was the programmer's interest in our bricolage approach. We used many aesthetic techniques to tell the story, helped by the computer technology now available for filmmakers. Digital technology adds a visually transgressive intertextuality that can be seen, obviously, in some of the dazzling choreography of such technologically hybrid Hollywood films, such as The Matrix, where, as it were, special effects are visually thrilling, if not the content, although Keanu Reeves looked rather good in his Prada, which compensates rather a great deal. And as we all know, the digital revolution will allow films to be beamed from satellites into cinemas all over the world. Film prints will become obsolete. In a sense, video projections in galleries anticipate this. Though the way that the art world critics refer to video projections as cinema is confusing, they are not the same. And in my new piece, Free, a film and video installation that uses single screen projection and triple screen projection in tandem, commenting on and deconstructing both media, I want to consider the relationship between new technologies, such as digital video, and old ones, such as 16mm projection. This exploration of the living image, I think, can be best sustained in a gallery context, and I think, obviously, it's very interesting the sort of developments that have been taking place precisely in that space versus the space of cinema. Now, obviously, in relationship to the categories of fine art, I think we have to say that obviously these categories are outmoded in relationship to debates around the cinema. I think in terms of describing moving image culture, that film obviously has always incorporated all the arts. Some have embellished its journey to maturity, others have killed it. And in a sense, you could say cinema obviously is dead and it's up to artists to resurrect it. Several shows from Spellbound 1996 at London's Hayward to the recent Cinema at the Stedelijk Van Abben Museum in Erdenhoven have displayed, as it were, a cinematic necrophilia combined with forms of neoconceptualism in an art world which is, as it were, surely in need of replenishment. Why are so many artists using cinema as a subject matter? I replied, I guess something had to replace painting. I recently saw Douglas Gordon's Look Through a Looking Glass show at the Gagosian Gallery in New York, an installation that consisted of 2 very large projections of one of Robert De Niro's most memorable scenes in Taxi Driver as Travis Bickle talking to himself in a mirror. It was just as if so-called cinema had replaced those huge paintings, such as Julian Snarball's. Artists like Stan Douglas, however, seem to be interested in making work that has cinematic interest beyond the textual surface of the image or its deconstruction. Yet in his show at the Center for the Arts last year in New York, he seemed concerned with something far more old-fashioned, something far more Brechtian, with changing the rules of representation, as it were, rather than, as it were, just playing with those for its own sake. And so therefore I agree with Mark Lewis, a fellow filmmaker, artist, that almost all 20th century art has been formed in relationship to the cinema. I think we only have to go to the Tate to see how the show between cinema and a hard place, where we can see that sort of underlining, as it were, preoccupation. In relationship to technical proficiency, my interest in technical proficiency outweighs that of most video artists who make films and video installations. Artists who do this kind of work as an extension of photography, painting or sculpture usually prioritize ideas over technique. This can be seen as a response to the much contemporary debate around filmmaking, which is technologically sophisticated but lower on ideas. And I would say that I aesthetically like the work that combines passion and technical proficiency, for instance, the installations of, say, Stan Douglas or Chris Marker. How conscious am I of making work in a gallery context with a different audience? My reply to that was essentially one's work doesn't change dramatically, but the piece's duration, the audience's concentration span in the gallery are not as dominated by the narrative drive. In a gallery context, a simple idea can go a long way. It's more like early cinema, when audiences come and go at their leisure, and I must confess that I rather admire gallery audiences' irreverent attitude to film. A new audience is being created for something akin to the kind of experimental cinema that has been dwindling because of changes in the taste and the media resources given to cultural filmmaking in this country. And obviously I say that with the knowledge that there is a new sort of film commission that's been set up, but obviously the sorts of films that they're interested in supporting are precisely not the ones which I'm interested in making. And so I think it's interesting to think about these sorts of ideas when I show you the first piece, which I'd like to show as a video. And I was going to show Trussed, but I wonder if I could show Free instead. Free came out of a collaboration between myself and B.B. Miller and Ralph Lemon. And it was produced with these choreographers, B.B. Miller and Ralph Lemon, along with a British actress called Claire Sylvester. And in Free, I wanted to explore aspects of desire through dance movements and symbolically weighted images. These, as it were, juxtaposed with social, cultural, and in some senses, religious sources, thereby rarefying a narrative which draws on and comments on interdisciplinary codes. Indeed, one of the objectives is to break down, as it were, barriers which exist between different artistic disciplines by uniting them, as it were, in this dialogue. And I think, obviously, the collaboration of this work, drawing from film, dance, photography, music, theatre, and sculpture, and uniting these into a poetic sort of landscape. So if we could start the video. There's a piece which appeared, which was video projected out into the street, and we have just gone into the sort of first, with the central image, which obviously has just changed. And this actual sort of, if you like, sort of object which was built was acted as a sort of visual sonata to the actual film. And in the piece, I was very interested in the idea of movement and weightlessness, and also the idea of framing something a bit how a Renaissance painting might be framed, if you like, with the two screens flipped either side. And essentially, when people walked into the space, they would see these images first, this sort of triptych. And in a sense, this piece was meant to have a sculptural sort of relation, both to the space of the actual gallery and also, if you like, comment on this sort of older technology, the film loop. And this is the actual beginning of the film Free, roughly 15 minutes long.
Why are you silent? This is what I'm going on. What's already happened. Happened to us. Well, nothing has really happened to us. We just is. And here he is once again. And once again, I am filling the air around your head and you are silent. So talk to me. I'm watching you. I want to see what you gotta say.
So I come close to you. I breathe you into me. I inhale you, right?
That's right.
And then I'm so close that I can't see where we are because it's too dark.
That may be too close.
There's a too close.
That's who we are. Sometimes we are attached so deeply that there's no air and we're diving low. And I'm lost. And sometimes I can't tell where you are apart from me.
Show me.
Show me.
Qu'au-delà des mers, là-bas, sur le ciel clair, il existe une cité au séjour enchanté. On dit qu'au-delà des mers, là-bas, sur le ciel clair, on dit qu'au-delà des mers, là-bas, sur le ciel clair, on dit qu'au-delà des mers, là-bas, sur le ciel clair, on dit qu'au-delà des mers, là-bas, sur le ciel clair, clair.
Again, I think that's probably enough. Well, anyway, from Free, you sort of, in a sense, begin to understand my relationship to making this piece, which actually began as its point of departure as a dance piece titled 2 in 1986. The choreographers, B. Miller and Ralph Lemon, had, as it were, made a piece. And with Free, what I wanted to do was to, as it were, play with the themes of intimacy, the gaze, and inside and outside spaces, problematizing gender and ethnicity in a way which would be slightly more provocative than the actual sort of duet itself. And my interest, as it were, in dance actually comes as a confession that I want to share with you when I was a member of the London Youth Dance Theatre based in Tower Hamlets, where I had danced with my Padadol partner, Gaby Agis. And obviously, after 2 years, or 3 years, I decided obviously that dance wasn't for me. There's a way in which you have to think about your body, etc., in a particular sort of way, which was really sort of far too demanding. But nonetheless, I actually saw quite a lot of dance at the place in the mid to late 70s. And it was there that I first heard about people like the Judson Dance Theatre and Evan Rayner. And obviously, as a student at St. Martin's School of Art, I became familiar with the work of Sally Potter and discovered the work of Maya Dern, which of course this film obviously is a sort of homage to her film study in choreography for the camera. And I was also, at the same time, while making this film, over a period of a couple of years, when I was first teaching cinema studies at New York University, I was struck by something that Annette Michelson had spoken of when she spoke about silent cinema. Although the camera was obviously very heavy, as a sort of instrument, because before, as it were, sort of 60mm film is sort of invented. But silent filmmakers, I would argue, used, as it were, the camera as a sort of fluid, sort of moving object. And it was obviously with the advent of sound that the technical apparatus, including microphones, became an increasing burden. And so in a sense, I'd argue that on the whole, sort of films, or people who made films, forgot about the potential for cinematic arts. And I think my exploration currently involved in dance is precisely a return to these sorts of interests. Now, the next piece I'd like to show you comes out of another collaboration. I'd like to show you The Long Road to Mazatlan. But before doing that, I'd just like to show you some slides of some work which I've been involved in for quite some time, which is sort of performance work. This is a performance which I did at between sort of 91 and 93. And I did this piece actually in response to some of the sort of encounters that I had with the Langston Hughes estate after I made Looking for Langston. And essentially what I wanted to do with this piece was to bring to the public's attention some of the more censorious, as it were, engagements that I had with the Hughes estate that wanted to censor the making of the film and showing of the film of Looking for Langston. And in this piece, in a sense, what I wanted to do was to allow the spectator to revisit certain spaces and locations which were similar to those where I had shot the actual film Looking for Langston. And the performances took place both in London, in Newcastle, and also at the Walker Art Centre in Minneapolis. And these are just sort of slides, as it were, from those performances. And I was very interested in the idea of cinema already being, as it were, sort of projected in a different sort of way from that of this sort of darkened space of an auditorium. And so in this piece, it was important to, as it were, kind of develop a sort of tour of the city and to explore different spaces that one would not ordinarily, as it were, visit. And obviously some of the scenes which were from Looking for Langston, which are restaged, were restaged with a certain amount of audience participation. And so in this sort of sequence, obviously, one of the things which is, I think, interesting about seeing these images versus that of Looking for Langston is precisely the way in which sort of colour and light sort of like is working versus the way in which the film sort of works, sort of, if you like, a sort of film noir sort of look. And the very end of the piece, which was called Undressing Icons, the spectator had to go to several different locations, and the last location was actually a party that took place. And one of the sort of performances which took place in that space was the actual arresting of subjects in that space. And it was the whole idea of trying to bring the notions of surveillance and performance that would be sort of twinned, as it were. So on the right-hand side, we have an actual clip from Trussed, which was the piece which was commissioned by Mama in Oxford. And this was, in a way, one of the first sort of film video installations that I made. It was commissioned by Chrissy Isles, who's now head of film at the Whitney Museum in America. And in this piece, I was very much playing with sort of black and white photography and working through, as it were, the debris of, if you like, a Robert Mapplethorpian sort of image of a gone-by era. And what I'd like to do, if it's possible, if I could show actually Trussed, which was going to be the first tape originally, Joe. And I talk a little bit about the making of Trussed in that piece.
Well, the main ideas behind a piece like Trussed is really to explore what I see as questions which are very much suppressed in our culture. And I have to be very specific here. I'm talking about British culture. And of course I'm talking about a certain community which I see myself belonging to, a gay community. In Britain we don't sort of talk about being ill, talk about being sick. Trust comes out of visualizing something which is not articulated, which is unsaid. And of course, you know, the unsaid does have a presence. What I was trying to do is to explore the questions of sickness and sadness and of melancholia, but also to explore questions of danger and desire. You know, how these, if you like, questions are very much twinned in the daily lives of gay men. In the piece, I work on reversing roles which would be usually assigned to black and white men. You know, positions of sort of dominance or passivity in sort of gay culture, and there's a sort of playing around with those representations in the piece. Trussed as a piece is very much influenced by the photography of Robert Mapplethorpe, George Platt Lyons, Van der Zee, Man Ray. What I'm really interested in doing is exploring, I suppose, the in-between space between film and photography, located at the nexus between sort of a moving image and a still image. In Trussed, one of the main themes, I suppose, is the theme of weightlessness and the body in space. You know, Trussed is a video projected piece which is double projected because I want audiences to be enveloped by the piece, to feel that they've entered into this sort of dream space and to become part of it.
You get some sort of idea of Trussed through this. But what I'd like to do now is to move on quickly to the newest piece of work which I've made, The Long Road to Mazatlan, which is an interdisciplinary multi-video screen projection and is the result of a collaboration between myself and dancer choreographer Javier de Frutas. The Long Road to Mazatlan is a synthesis of performance and meditations on masculine desire and its relationship to American landscape within the mythologies of the West. Shot in San Antonio, Texas, the project was developed in residence while I was at Art Pace, a foundation for contemporary arts in San Antonio, and was co-commissioned with Grand Arts Kansas City. Discussions between myself and Javier de Frutas concerned cinema and dance catalyzed this project. The filming of Mazatlan provided a space for us to address, as it were, our shared concerns and issues around notions of identity and representation in relationship to sexuality and masculinity.
both on the stage and in film. Specifically, we found a similarity in explorations, as it were, of icons of gay sexuality and culture, and deciphering codes, as it were, of masculine behavior, with a strong interest in America. And obviously, we were also interested in something we could identify as hybridized cultures located in the globalization of the Americas and within the imaginary of the local, and one only had to look at the expressive fashions in London's gay subculture to witness the homage to Texan dress codes. In Mazatlan, connections are made with the Western landscape ranging from the mariachi Tex-Mex bars to the stockyard to the chorus girls, locations where culture, space, and identity are explored. The film literally strips down the ideals, if you like, of mythic white masculinity into something that has to be performed. The result is a repertoire of repressed bodily gestures, which were performed by Philippe Rière and Javier de Frutas. And, if you like, these characters explore their phantasmatic dependencies on images of masculinity in our culture, which dominate, as it were, the cinematic genres, including the Western action film or art cinemas, all which are quoted in the piece. These cinematic references, as it were, abroad, including De Niro's performance as Travis Bickle, which is also a sort of pun on Douglas Gordon's piece, installation piece that he did at the Gagosian Gallery, in Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver, David Hockney's Swimmer and Pause, and Andy Warhol's Lonesome Cowboys. Long Road to Mazatlan explores these mythologies of the American West, the iconic figure of the cowboy and the trajectory within gay culture, and also the film, as it were, tries to deliberately disturb emotional readings, hopefully playing and subverting preconceptions of race and sexuality in a hopefully iconic and ironic, much-layered way. So if we could show the Long Road to Mazatlan, and this piece is roughly about 20 minutes. It's a free-screen piece, and what you're seeing is a sort of stimulated sort of video, computer-generated version of it, which I've been working with computer now for several years, as I said earlier.
Are you looking at me? 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 Are you looking at me?
So in this piece, Along the Road to Mazatlan, which is a collaboration between myself and Javier de Frutas, we see this piece as a fusion between movie and movement. And David Frankel, quite known architect for Art Forum, has written recently in a catalogue essay, which is part of a show which I'm going to be having, which opens in New York in September. And in fact, this piece will open at Manchester Corner House along with various photographers and Vagabondia, which is the last piece I want to show you. But in it, he talks about the way in which, in this piece, there is a visible displacement, which is formal. He says here that Julien uses 3 screens, which are but in a row, fracturing cinema's controlling illusion of a single intact vision. He arranges the projections on these screens in every possible permutation. As the video starts, a long shot of a man walking on a hot Texas road runs across all 3 screens, its width suggesting a miniaturized version of CinemaScope. The picture soon fragments. At the center shows the carver in the road, while the screens left to right fill with the snake's moving skin, examining so closely that we may need the cue of the center image to identify it. Next, the snake skin shifts to the center screen, while the screen returns to the shot of the road. Through a different man appears in each one. Elsewhere, the screens may show separate parts of the same space, 2 booths in a bar, say, or the same action from several perspectives or actions that seem but are not, which seem the same but which are not. They may repeat identical images in visual shutter or a pair of shots with its mirror image or combined in a composite image. The composite image in turn may appear whole or parts may misalign. The quality of the colour too may vary from screen to screen. A sequence may jump into black and white. This is hardly conventional film syntax, yet rhythmic editing creates a sinuous flow. The Long Road to Mazatlan does have a narrative, a kind of boy meets boy loses boy, although it makes little distinction between actions and interior imaginings, and doesn't so much tell a story as shuffle its components, the pre-existing genres, images and character types of white American culture. The CinemaScope-like opening shot is obviously meant to be Sergio Leone, and he quotes me here, I wanted you to feel you were at the movies. The 2 men dress as cowboys, one wears white, the other black, a classic trope of the Western. But Julien and de Frutas are also interested in more recent cowboy imagery, particularly in the gay culture of recent decades. So that there's a scene in a theatre-like cattle auction hall is inspired by Andy Warholm's Lonesome Cowboy, 68, and just as it were, Looking for Langston, 1989, Julien remembered the photographs of Robert Mapplethorpe, George Platt Lyons, James Vandersea, and here the painters of Hockney inform scenes at an outdoor pool. In fact, the whole work has a sort of lush visual texture that Julien calls painterly. The video's most explicit quotation is to Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver, 1976, where De Niro asks the mirror, "Are you talking to me?" Julien's man in black plays more goofy with the same moves, but asks a different question, "Are you looking at me?" Long Road to Mazatlan is intensely sensitized to the act of looking, the people watching each other or watching movies. What interested Julien about the auction hall, for example, was its similarity to the panopticon, the prison architecture that Michael Foucault described as a space observed at every point in which individuals are inserted in a fixed place, in which all events are recorded, in which power is exercised without division, in which individuals is constantly located, examined, distributed among living beings. And he sort of goes on a little bit. So anyway, what I'd like to do is to end this by showing you a piece that I did at the John Soane Museum. And obviously, John Soane being a very prominent architect, we were sort of asked to respond as artists to the actual space of the John Soane Museum. And in doing that, when I was approached by Hans Borsbrick to make a piece, I decided I wanted to make a piece which would somehow sort of look at the history of this space and to, as it were, respond to the space in a very, if you like, emotional sort of way in relationship to the presence of what I saw as a certain repressed sort of modernity to that space. And what I have to show you is really just a sort of scene of Cleo Sylvester, who has played a conservator character in many of my films. But I won't be able to show you the sort of double screen version of it. I can only show you a single screen version of it, and only an extract, but I do have some slides of it just to show you how it visually looks. If I could. So these are from Trussed and from Free, and these are slides from the Long Road to Mazatlan, which you've just seen. Photograph of Havre de Frutas, and obviously when the piece is shown, it's projected in this sort of sculptural sort of formation, which sort of holds the image suspended sort of in space, if you like. And these are just some sort of scenes from Vagabondia, which is a work in progress, which I'm working on now. Cleo Sylvester on the right, and then a photograph of me in my version of A Yellow Room, which is obviously a meditation on John Soane's Yellow Room. And in Vagabondia, I'm developing a sort of double screen sort of motif, but doing some of the sort of visual sort of manipulation, which is in the Long Road to Mazatlan. And in the piece, I have Mark Nash, who plays Sir John Soane, in the background, and there's a narrative which develops as she sort of unfolds various sort of facades of the museum. And we sort of, in this, I would say in this piece, we sort of architecturally explore this space, but I'm very interested, as I said, to bring out something of the repressed side of modernity in that space. And the reason why the piece is called Vagabondia is a meditation on the black presence in the 18th century London street. There was one sort of black beggar that was very famous who wore an actual ship on his head. And so in the piece, which unfortunately I can't show you, that sort of metaphor is being developed in the piece as it sort of, as the sort of, if you like, sort of images that sort of progress. And I see the Sir John Soane Museum as a very kinky space, actually, a very fetishistic space. And so there's some of that exploration in the piece. But the video piece that you're going to see is really the first sort of chapter which I shot, which was on view at that exhibition last year. So if you could just show the last video, please. And it's silent. The actual name of the exhibition was called Retrace Your Steps, Remember Tomorrow. And so in this piece, I was trying to visually work that sort of motif in some sort of way. And that's it. So, maybe you have some questions about these odd presentations which I've just given you. And certainly sort of in Vagabondia, I'm sort of very interested in what would be a sort of response, as it were, from sort of architects or students of architecture, only because obviously he has a pretty central role in the history of architecture in England. Sure. Well, really, in the piece Long Road to Mazatlan, it developed from doing my installation work of Free at the Victoria Miro Gallery. And essentially, I'm very interested in the notion of expanded cinema and of the notion of the way in which sort of time can be collapsed in relationship to sort of viewing, if you like. And so in the Long Road to Mazatlan, it's precisely sort of the bringing together of a sort of multi-perspectival sort of view to sort of frustrate the gaze in some way of looking, at the same time to, if you like, explore sort of the ways in which I think different angles can situate, if you like, the spectator in their sort of looking relations, and in a way to sort of not disturb their sort of identification while looking, but to, if you like, just to try and subvert the ways in which one would ordinarily sort of, as it were, experience a cinematic sort of viewing experience. And I think in relationship to, I think, if you like, some of the sort of more conservative developments which have developed in cinema sort of recently, my return to sort of multi-screen work comes out of working on the computer as well, and also trying to explore, if you like, just a notion of doubling, which I explored in territories, but it was always in a sort of multi-layered sort of effect, if you like, and in the same frame, rather than a sort of exploration of that sort of outside of the frame. And so kind of I think the notion of expanded cinema, which are sort of quite old-fashioned notions in a sense, and also the sort of idea of creating a certain sort of visual sort of intensity, but also in terms of the formal aspect, I can return back to some of the more sort of painterly sort of preoccupations that I sort of first explored when I made my sort of early films, before that of Looking for Langston, or even in the collective that I worked, where I sort of made films which were sort of double-screened work or triple-screened work. And so in a way it's a return back to some older sort of formalistic, if you like, preoccupations.
Could I maybe kind of follow on?
Sure.
In a way ask you, I suppose it's really to ask how you approve between kind of cinema on the one hand, you know, I mean, the Langston students, the young cell levels, is both part of and is addressed to kind of cinema, however kind of revisionist kind of level, you know, is supposed to be seen in a cinema, is hopefully addressed to as wide as possible kind of cinema audience, and that's what organizes its
But in fact, sort of, you know, I think you're absolutely right. There is obviously a kind of infrastructural sort of problem, I think, with the financing of films which are, as it were, not adhering to certain sort of narratives or traditions, etc. But in the case of both Free and The Long Road to Mazatlan, there are single-screen versions of them. And in fact, I just did a single-screen version of Mazatlan for the London Production Fund, and Channel 4 have already expressed some interest in showing that. And in fact, how one always was funded initially was through television, and it was always a dual sort of hybridized sort of strategy that you would show something in the cinema, but also would actually be shown on television, and that would be its widest audience. But certainly, also in the case of Free, it's a single screen piece of work, and it's been shown in different film festivals, and has had the same sort of, if you like, theatrical life that sort of other films would have. So, in a way, kind of, I think my response to your question in relationship to both the question of form, but also the question around sort of funding, is that when I've made these projects, I've been able to attract both spaces, you know, so both a sort of, if you like, museum sort of context for the Bard show, which is happening in September and then goes to Sydney and to Sweden, and also at the same time, one hopes that one can also have that political engagement with a different audience, a wider audience. And so in a way, there's a dual approach. And I think that that's developed really sort of as a response to, as it were, a sort of diminishing of resources to certain works such as this, which would be interested in a formal sort of exploration. And also a certain demand or interest from a sort of, if you like, museum sort of context. So in the case of Long Road to Mazatlan, which when it's shown on Proxima projectors, which are sort of 27 luminum. It has 10 speakers, 2 subwoofers. The sculptural sort of installing of it is quite complicated. And so it's like a version of cinema in a sense. And at the same, yeah.
You know, when you have the possibility, you know, you think like in 2.5 weeks there are 500,000 people face to face, you know, there's no longer any kind of structural necessity to differentiate this in terms of the size of the audience.
No, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a sort of shift that has taken place in a sense, and that shift is precisely located in those sorts of shifts in sort of audience reception as well.
I'm interested to know how far you agree with pop critics such as Paul Gilroy, who's particularly emphasized aspects of black culture, whereas the indicative of difference and identity now become palatable and subsumed into mainstream black culture. What do you think is a positive view? What do you think is a positive view
Certainly, I've been privy to many debates with Paul in relationship to his new book, which is interestingly titled Against Race in America and Between Two Camps in the British context. And I think in relationship to, you know, some of Paul's observations, I mean, the observations which Zizek was making actually around the question of multicultural sort of commodification, if you like, and its sort of corporate sort of suturing with capitalist ends. And I think sort of, you know, that one's witnessed that over the past several years. You know, so I'm completely in agreement with Paul. I guess where I differ with Paul is that I think there's a way in which sort of, I think in parts of the book, and obviously, you know, he would have lots of problems with some of the sort of later work, I think. It's precisely the idea that sort of images are sort of, if you like, sort of ideologically kind of sort of impure by their very sort of construction, you know, and the fact that obviously we have, as it were, sort of images which exist in popular culture, which are sort of utilizing sort of versions of epidemialization, the corporal sort of schema, sort of skin difference, to market and to sell, and to also fix notions of sort of racial sort of identity and playing with that, is also a factor. But I think there's also something else in those representations, something that's a bit more slippery, perhaps, you know. So in other words, I think there's a slightly moralistic sort of discourse that's been attached to the way that those representations and images are sort of working. But certainly I think, you know, there has to be some critique around globalization and the sort of, if you like, play that race has performed in that, especially in African American culture, which I think is where he's really trying to put that critique towards. You know, and certainly sort of, I think in his book he makes references to Leni Riefenstahl and makes references to that and Nike and to the idea of certain types of bodies which get represented. And in some ways I think that his ideas, you know, are very close to, I can think of a book around the title of Denigration of Vision, you know, where there's some sort of similar sort of arguments in sort of French theory around the notion of the troubling sort of idea that the vision sort of brings about. But I think that Paul's critique is very interesting, but I mean, I don't think that Paul is really talking about art in that sort of sense. It seems to be much more around the domains of sort of popular culture and the way in which those images are signifying at the moment.
So I've got two kind of questions. One, I was wondering how you kind of relate yourself to like the men like Carl Hardy, who kind of started out like artful and big like mainstream film, and secondly I wondered why you basically made him kind of American. If that's right.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Hal Hartley, because I first met Hal Hartley when I made Looking for Langston, and he made a film called The Unbelievable Truth, which is by all means a very Godardian, funny film, which I really enjoyed. And subsequently, we've seen less of Hal Hartley's films. You know, one has to go to Paris to see Hal Hartley movies these days. But certainly it would seem to me that in his filmmaking practice, and I'm thinking of his most recent film, there's been a return to a certain experimentation of the image, in fact. I was able to see some rushes of his recent work, in fact. And certainly I can think of other filmmakers like Atom McGowan, for example, who's also made interesting interventions in cinema, in narrative film, in experimentation. And he, when he made his last film, said that he really has to go back to some of his sort of original kind of visual inquiries, that he feels that he's got very lost in this sort of milieu of sort of big movie making sort of business. So I'm not trying to sort of, if you like, construct a sort of binarism between sort of experimental film and sort of mainstream cinema. Of course, I think sort of, you know, the two can coexist and in a sort of intertextual way comment upon one another. But in relationship to your latter question, I mean, I've really been very interested in the notion of diaspora and the notion of a certain post-nationalist sort of cinema. And so, obviously, one makes films from a certain perspective, but those, for me, are not very connected to, if you like, the question of location or nationalism in that sort of way. So one's always been interested in sort of transgressing those sort of boundaries in terms of a national cinema. But certainly there's been an interest in America for me, but I think that's been one which goes hopefully against the grain of its sort of globalized sort of, you know, sort of version, which, you know, has its effects, as it were, in the local sphere, which are quite problematic, obviously.
I think we have to trace the
films themselves, almost they're quite sort of dumb, it's there. Just, I mean, how do you see them being read? Just as what they are, or do they rely upon some sort of intellectual understanding fully?
It's an interesting question around pedagogy. I mean, in a sense, I think there's a way in which I would like films to be read by as wide an audience. And obviously, in some instances, one makes films for different sorts of audiences. But I've always felt the question of, and the notion of audience has been something that's been very strongly attached, as it were, to one's work in a way which I haven't obviously always been as interested in. But I think in relationship to the question of intellectualism or the ways in which one would have to have access to certain discourses, I've always seen, I mean, I'm an artist that's been very much influenced by, you know, sort of generation of artists. I'm thinking of artists like Victor Bergin or Mary Kelly. That these artists, to me, have been very important. Also, I can think of sort of Laura Mulvey as another artist, or theorists, and you could say they've almost been sort of models, in fact. And so it's precisely sort of in this book, this sort of, that's being done where there are sort of several essays, collaborative essays by myself, along with the sort of exhibition, sort of catalogue, if you like, where you get the two things which get sort of stitched together, you know, awkwardly actually. And I think in a way, kind of thinking about those sorts of questions, I'd like to think that there's ways of reading text which can be sort of multi-perspectivalized, if you like, that don't necessarily rely on certain epistemologies, but obviously kind of, in some instances, obviously there's a sort of, you know, deeper debate within some of the sort of visual strategies and some of the references in the work. So a film like Free is a very cinephile film for those who are familiar with sort of Maradon's work, and could be seen as a very baroque piece of work, you know, or a kitsch piece of work by others. I mean, so I think similarly, a film like France Fanon, Black Skins, White Masks, which I made with Mark Nash, that film certainly has been seen as a far too intellectual film, and it's precisely that film that was, in a sense, my last, if you like, television commission, but already one had felt in television that it had become slightly closed. But on that, there's an interesting series which I'm going to be working on in the summer, which is called Swen, and the idea of this series, which will be broadcast at the end of July, is the notion that artists take over the news, and there's some very interesting sort of projects and developments which I think will be happening in that sort of series, possibly. But certainly sort of the spaces for intellectual interventions of this kind, I think, have become less, I think, and have shifted themselves into different sort of spaces.
Okay, well, I think that so long and enough, and I thank you guys very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.